The man they called Killer Petey walked through the prison corridor like he belonged there more than the guards did. In São Paulo, the air inside the blocks stayed hot and sour, heavy with sweat, smoke, and the metallic smell of bars that never cooled. Inmates pressed to the rails as he passed. Some stared, some looked away. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was small compared to the men around him, but his reputation filled space. He had arrived behind those walls already famous for killing, and he kept killing in custody, turning the place that was meant to contain him into another hunting ground. He was born on October 29, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. Later accounts said his childhood began with violence in the home, and it did not soften him. By his early teens, he was already carrying anger like a weapon. At 14, he committed the first murders that would define his life. He believed his father had been wronged after losing a job as a school guard, and Pedro took revenge, shooting the deputy mayor he blamed and then killing a guard he suspected of being the real thief. Those acts forced him onto the run and into a world where living meant moving, and surviving meant striking first. He fled to the outskirts of São Paulo, to Mogi das Cruzes, and the pattern expanded. He robbed drug dens, targeted traffickers, and began killing men he believed deserved it. In Brazil's criminal underworld, that kind of violence could build a twisted kind of fame. Newspapers and street talk turned him into a myth in motion, a teenager who killed other criminals and claimed it was justice. The nickname followed him, Pedrinho Matador, Little Pedro the Killer. As he grew older, the line between vigilantism and gang violence thinned until it disappeared. He fell in with criminal groups, and the killings multiplied. He lived with a woman known as Botinha, stepping into the orbit of a local drug boss. When she was murdered by rivals while pregnant, Pedro responded the way he always did. He hunted men connected to her death and killed them. In interviews later, he described revenge as if it were a duty, a rule that could not be broken. The killings drew attention from police and from other criminals. Pedro said he targeted drug dealers, murderers, and men he labeled as predators, and he insisted he avoided innocent victims. But even by the standards of the streets, he was uncontrollable. Bodies appeared. Stories spread. He boasted to investigators and journalists, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes describing details with unsettling calm. He claimed over the years that his count reached 100 or more. Officially, Brazilian authorities tied him to dozens upon dozens of murders. He was convicted on 71 counts, a number that appeared again and again in case summaries. On May 24, 1973, at 18, he was arrested. The courts sentenced him to an enormous term, more than a century on paper, but Brazilian law at the time limited how long a person could actually remain imprisoned. Even so, Pedro stayed inside for decades. Prison did not rehabilitate him. It gave him a new stage. He told anyone who would listen that he continued killing behind bars, selecting victims from within the inmate population. He described it as cleansing. Other prisoners described it as terror. Reports and later profiles credited him with murdering dozens of inmates while incarcerated. Some accounts said he killed men he believed were rapists or violent offenders. Whether every claim was true or inflated, the pattern was consistent. Violence followed him, and he used prison hierarchy, intimidation, and opportunity to keep it going. One of the most notorious stories attached to him involved his father. Pedro claimed in interviews that he killed his father in prison in retaliation for his mother's death, turning the act into a personal verdict carried out with his own hands. Later reporting and biographical work questioned parts of that account. What remained undeniable was that Pedro's public persona was built on a blunt message. He believed he had the right to decide who deserved to live, and he was proud of it. In 2007, after 34 years behind bars, he walked out of prison. The release shocked many Brazilians who knew his name. On paper, he had been sentenced to far more time than any one lifetime could serve. In reality, the law capped imprisonment, and the state let him go. For a brief stretch, he stayed quiet, living away from the spotlight, trying to survive outside the walls that had become his environment. But violence had not released its hold on him. In 2011, he was arrested again, tied to incidents that occurred while he was detained in São Paulo, including riot-related charges and deprivation of liberty. He was sentenced again and remained in custody until he was released for good behavior in December 2018. After that second release, he reappeared in public in a way few expected. He became a YouTuber, speaking directly to an audience that treated him like a dark celebrity. On camera, he warned against gang life and criticized criminals, presenting himself as a reformed man who had turned away from killing. He spoke as if he were proof that a monster could grow old and change. At the same time, his fame still fed on the same contradiction. A man who said he punished criminals, yet lived as a criminal himself for most of his life. In the 1970s and 1980s, Brazil's prisons overflowed, and the justice system often moved slowly, and that reality helped explain why a figure like Pedro could gain admirers. In neighborhoods squeezed by organized crime, some people wanted simple answers. If the courts could not protect them, a man who killed criminals looked, to them, like a shortcut to safety. Pedro fed that hunger. He talked about targets instead of victims, and he framed murder as punishment, even when he was simply expanding his own power. Inside prison, his legend became a kind of currency. Guards and inmates understood that violence was a language, and Pedro spoke it fluently. Reports and profiles repeated stories of him attacking fellow inmates and claiming a personal code for who deserved to die. Whether every detail was accurate or inflated, the effect was real. Men avoided him. Others tried him and paid for it. And the courts, for all their numbers, could not erase the fact that the law still placed limits on confinement. He was sentenced to 126 years on paper, but the state could not legally hold him forever. When he finally walked free after 34 years, he carried the same story with him, one that made him look like justice instead of what the records showed, a serial killer who chose his own victims. His story ended where much of it had begun. On March 5, 2023, in Mogi das Cruzes, he was attacked in broad daylight and killed. Early reporting suggested it may have been revenge. The man who had spent decades claiming to be an executioner of the guilty died abruptly and violently, without a court deciding the sentence. Pedro Rodrigues Filho became a symbol in Brazil that people argued over. Some called him a vigilante. Others called him what the case files showed, a prolific killer who used a moral story to justify murder. He left behind confessions, interviews, and criminal records thick with bodies and claims. And in the end, the line he insisted existed, the line between justice and killing, collapsed into the same darkness where he had always lived. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.